You know, as we approach this gospel reading today, I have in my memory a couple of the storms that we've had this summer, and some of you may have experienced the brunt of some of those storms. I don't know if any of you lost trees or property, up on, did they call that 3-lane hill? Somebody, huh? Oh, somebody I thought told me 3-lane hill, and I thought, well, I don't understand that. But where the farmer lost his barn and stuff, and 2 silos out of 3, and then the antique car was sitting there with hardly a scratch on it. Almost unbelievable. But where Mary Jo, my wife, and I live, we're right where Lake Pepin comes back in and becomes the Mississippi River again. And we're about a half mile down from Lecopolis there. And that first storm especially, we could see it coming. The wind had picked up, so the waves turned into some pretty heavy whitecaps. And then you could see this sheet, this wall of rain coming across. And we weren't very prepared for that one. We hadn't battened down the hatches, so to speak. And there was at least one boat that we happened to notice that didn't believe the weather reports. And he came out of the lake and he was beating his tail trying to get down to, I suppose, the marina in Wabasha. And I assume he made it because we never heard any reports. But I thought, how often are we given a gem, we're given notice of what's going to come, and we don't pay attention to it? The second storm, a few weeks later, Mary Jo and I did prepare for it. I doubled the tarps over the boat, and I made sure all the doors were locked up and everything was put away. And we sat there and experienced the brunt of it without any qualms at all. We weren't nervous at all. What we're talking about today is storms and how they can have such an impact on our lives. And when we try to take care of those storms on our own, with our own abilities and skill sets, what we experience instead is often fear, because we realize occasionally a storm comes along that we do not have the ability to handle. I'm going to start with a few quotes. I like quotations. I like to in preparation for a conversation like this, I like to see what other people are thinking and how it fits in. So I'll start out with one that most of us have heard, at least the first couple lines. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom. It was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. And then I paraphrase a little bit. It was a season of sunshine. It was the season of storms. Charles Dickens wrote that back in the 1850s, I think. And his setting was the French Revolution. But as we think about those words, he could have been talking about today, especially because now I'll admit this, but please don't go and tell anybody that I said this. Mary Jo and I are becoming political junkies. We can't get our eyes off this age of foolishness that we seem to be living in. I'm sorry if I offend anybody, but it seems like everybody is able to point a finger, but nobody has good answers. Nobody knows how to calm the storm, right? Okay, so that was one that got me. Another one is Warren Buffett. I've always been interested by that man, in that he's one of these guys that he's got a huge amount of resources, but I get the image that he would be just as comfortable having a hot dog at a picnic in the city park. You know what I mean? And I guess the reason I thought of him, because the other day he came out and said that he was going to personally drive people to the polling places in November. Not hire cabs to do it, or Uber. He personally, at 85 or 6, was going to drive people. That man lives out his convictions. He doesn't hire somebody else to do it for him. And we as Christians, I think, we can learn from that kind of activity. Do for someone else what you can do. Don't think somebody else will do it for you. So Warren Buffett is the guy who said that everything that ever happened to him that's good can be traced back to the fact that he was born in these United States at the right time in history. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't live out your life well in other countries or at other points in time, but what he was saying is that the United States of America provides opportunity that no place else does on a consistent basis. It doesn't matter where you start. That doesn't define where you end up. And as Christians, I think that's important for us to remember as well. Because sometimes we'll carry a little blanket of guilt around with us, thinking, well, I can't be as good as another Christian I know because of where I started. And that's not true. God's ability to transform our lives through the presence and power of the Holy Spirit and the inspiration of Jesus Christ has no bounds. So, don't ever say, I've risen as high as I'm going to rise, because God might have a couple more levels for you in mind. So Warren Buffett kind of got me to thinking about that thing. But he also got me thinking about that we do live in really stormy political times in our United States. It's not just political, it's societal. All the difficulties we have on the streets, and I'm underplaying when I say difficulties, the murders and the assassinations and the hatred that spews out day in and day out. Economically, things aren't going as well as we would like. We've recovered from the Great Recession, but a lot of people have been left behind with stagnated wages and still underwater, perhaps in real estate that they own, different things like that. So some have gone, well, life is good again, but there's a lot who still are left behind, and we probably know some of those people. And spiritually, I think spiritually we live in a stormy time as well. You know, some of us in the older part of this group, we remember a time where these church pews would have been full. And nowadays, it seems like people are very content to let somebody else pray for them, but they're not going to get involved in the work of praying themselves. They're not going to get involved in the work of the congregation or the church. You know, years ago they used to call them C&Es. You know, we all know what a C&E is, right? Yeah, somebody who attends at Christmas and at Easter. And to be honest, a lot of them have cut out the Easter one, so they're just C's. But the congregational life of today is not what it was a generation ago, or 2 generations ago, or 3 generations ago. I don't know if I've mentioned it before, but my wife grew up in the Methodist Church. I grew up Lutheran. And in our little community, the Methodist Church, the youth group, they had so much going on that you almost begged one of your Methodist friends for an invite. This little community of 600 people, this little Methodist church of 200 members, they would have 75 to 100 people show up for the youth events. Isn't that crazy? It's absolutely crazy. But that's because the decision to live the church as your social hub was one that everybody bought into. And the church was providing the programming and the activities that allowed a 12-year-old or a 14-year-old to want to invite somebody, to want them to experience that joy. And so we don't have that either. So sometimes we get down on that, and we start thinking, well, things just aren't going to work out. It's a storm. And Jesus can provide us with the spiritual energy to overcome that storm. I'm getting a little off track. I want to lift up one more person, perhaps not of the stature of Charles Dickens or Warren Buffett, Will Smith, the actor. You never thought you'd hear him quoted at the pulpit, did you? Will Smith has been on TV on the talk shows recently. For why? As every actor does, because there's a movie coming out that he's in. Suicide something. I've only seen the trailers, but it's stupid. I think so. I agree with you there. But anyway, he was asked a very sober question, and he gave a very sober response. The question from the host was, what do you think about all the darkness we're experiencing in our society today. In the context of our conversation, what do you think about the storminess of our time? And Will Smith, who I have to admit, I don't put him high on my list of philosophers, he gave, I thought, a very, very thoughtful response, and one that perhaps I wouldn't have come to on my own without somebody kind of prompting me. He said, in this dark time, I would say stormy time, he sees it as a sign of hope. Now, isn't that strange? Mostly young people being shot in the streets, police officers being ambushed, hatred being spewed out of people's mouths and the signs they hold up. He says, I see it as a sign of hope. And I thought, what kind of medication did he take before he came on that show? But here's his point, and it's important for us as well. The sign of hope that he sees is our difficulties, our distrust and our disunity and all that separates us that we so carefully hide underneath the table. He says, now that it's out on the streets the way it is, it's on top of the table. We can't ignore it. We can't pretend it doesn't exist. We have to take a look at the biases that we hold, perhaps some of the racial underpinnings that we might have that we don't acknowledge in public, and much less to ourselves, perhaps even. He says all that is up on the table. The darkest moment in our lives is a sign of hope because we have to deal with it. I kind of see that in that story of Jesus and the disciples. They were in a dark, dark place. And they recognized that they couldn't ignore the reality that Jesus Christ had a power beyond their own power, an ability beyond their own ability. They got into that boat with darkness approaching, going out onto a lake that was notorious for evening storms. And the lake isn't a long, narrow lake like Pepin. It's kind of a big, round lake. It's more like 13 by 18 miles or something like that. That math wouldn't add up right. Because it's 64 square miles, so you recognize that math won't be right. But it's one of those ones where it's difficult to see the other side. And so for them to go out in the night as darkness is approaching, knowing the possibilities of a storm, and they're going to have to travel that, let's call it 10 miles, across the lake to get to the other side. Now, some of them are seasoned fishermen and sailors, and they must have had some trepidation about doing it. But they had enough trust, enough faith, that if Jesus said do it, we'll do it. It might be they based that trust and that faith on the fact that we're good sailors, so we can take care of any problem that comes up. The only reason we agree with them is because we know that we've got the ability and the skill set to take care of those kinds of problems. And they get out on the lake, and what happens? They find out that they are inadequate on their own. And what's the first thing they do in that storm, in that darkness? They reach out to the one who carries the light. Now, they might not have done it in the best way by saying, don't you care if we drown? But maybe we would say exactly the same thing. Not those words, but kind of complaining to Christ. Don't you know the pain I'm going through? Can't you take this from me? We live in stormy times, as did our parents and our grandparents and every generation before. The reality of our human experience is that the emotions don't change. Maybe the way we communicate them. You know, I don't write a note to anybody anymore. I don't call them on the phone anymore. I'm still stuck in texting, I admit. So I haven't gone up to the, I don't know, what would it be? Instant messaging or Snapchatting or I don't know, whatever it is. But the emotions I'm trying to communicate are the same. But I recognize there's limitations. My text can be misinterpreted. So face-to-face is better than any other form of communication. Part of it, I think, is saying to that person, I want to take the time to look you in the eye and tell you what I'm thinking. Tell you what I want to give you or what I need from you. Tell you how we can do something together. We were talking just a little bit ago before this service started about communication is the most difficult thing for many organizations to do well. And churches probably are at the top of the list of organizations that don't do it well. Those who are working on projects and ministry opportunities, it becomes so infused in their life that they think everybody must know what's going on. But they don't. So I'm glad that it was mentioned about the August 10th auction, because just a couple days ago my wife said, when is that auction? And the best I could say was August. I didn't know beyond that. So communication is important. And how do we keep those lines of communication open the best? This leads us to a whole other issue. And that issue is that, sometimes our connection with Jesus Christ, our connection with the church, is not built on having a personal relationship, but it's rather just plugging ourselves into a religious experience or institution. And so we miss out on a lot of stuff because when we plug ourselves in, we feel we can unplug ourselves. But when you're in a relationship, a true, genuine, authentic relationship, you can't pull the plug. You're connected no matter what. Our relationship starts at baptism, and it moves on from there. In our particular way of understanding, baptism really is an entry point in which we grow up a child so that they might claim Jesus for themselves as Savior and Lord at confirmation. So baptism is going to be a 14-year process, as opposed to an adult baptism where that person is choosing of their own will and understanding. So it's a little difficult sometimes to know exactly when we start our relationship with Christ. But relationship over just sterile religion is very important, and sometimes we downplay that. One of the things that I've really enjoyed in retirement, I've been retired for the second time now for over a year, and what I enjoy is that I can chew on something for a day at a time, or 2 or 3 days. When you go off to work every day, if you're in the workplace, you've got a series of things that must get accomplished day by day. Now, I have to admit, as a clergy, that list is it's very dynamic. It's not static. I don't think any clergy person does the same thing every day. The door is open, so anybody walks in, they have mostly 90% of the time it's a problem they put on your desk, not a joy or a wonderful opportunity. So we have to limit the amount of just philosophy. Like one of my sisters said, she imagined me being a frog on a log, thinking about God all day long. And we don't get that opportunity. But really, we should all be able to spend more time at it. But I think as a pastor, I think it's important for them to keep that groundedness. So in retirement, what I enjoy is when I find something in my morning meditations that really clicks or creates a question mark that's big, I can spend all day long thinking about that and nothing else. You ever done that? So I'm building a shed for my daughter. I'm not thinking about building a shed. That's why it's a little crooked on one corner if you look at it close, but I'm thinking about something else. Let me give you a couple examples. Anybody know Zig Ziglar? You ever heard that guy? I think, has he passed away?
Yeah.
Yeah. Motivational speaker, and my wife had a set of CDs that was part of her work, grow and work experience. And so that's where I got acquainted with him. That was 20 years ago. But he said something that I think makes sense for us, not just as individuals, but for us as the institutional church, the presence of Christ in unity. When you focus on problems, what do you get? More problems. When you focus on possibilities, what do you get? More opportunities. The possibilities open up in positive ways. So often, as a congregation, we look at the negatives, we look at the darkness of the storm, and we forget that there is light out there. We forget that God has given us the opportunity to go out and share the love of Christ with the world. Instead, we focus on our problems. And as Zig Ziglar says, we end up with more problems. I'm going to give you just two more. I've got a whole list of them here. We don't have time. I want to paraphrase. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not making a political dig here, but I want to paraphrase Michelle Obama. Paraphrasing someone named James Lane Allen, who originally this quote is given to. It's a paraphrase. It's not an actual quote. She was talking about her husband Barack and about character, and whether he grew in character during his years in office. And my paraphrase is, living in stormy times doesn't build character. It reveals character. Isn't that right? Now you can think on that for a long, long time. God has given us all the good qualities we need. Stormy times reveals those qualities. Stormy times is when we realize we reach out to Jesus Christ. We can't rely on our own inadequacies. Living in stormy times doesn't build character, it reveals character. Now, the last one is the one that I know some of you will take home with you. And somebody between services said, we should have people next week write down anything they remember from the previous week's sermon. Wouldn't that be interesting? Because if it was a test, we'd all be taking notes, wouldn't we? We'd be paying more attention. I had the last church I was at in Buffalo, there was a woman a little bit younger than Mary Jo and I, and she kept a notebook, a little notebook. And when I announced that we were retiring, she was kind of upset. And afterwards, she kind of laughed because she says, you won't believe what happened. She says, your last sermon was the last page. There were no more pages left in that notebook. You know, it was just kind of interesting, but she kept notes. Not because I said great things, but because there were things that resonated with what were going on in her life, and she needed to think about them during the week. So here's the last one. The one that I don't know, I can't attribute the quote to it. So, live your life so that the preacher won't have to lie at your funeral. Does that make sense? Because, you know, as a pastor, I don't like to lie, but I hate at the funeral to have nothing to say. Live your life so that the preacher won't have to lie at your funeral. Now that only makes sense to us as Christians who have a relationship with Jesus Christ. For those who aren't Christians, they're not thinking about anything beyond their own personal needs. And their funeral will be some generic, the cat at the funeral home meows and it's a done deal. That's not true, but somebody told me once in North Carolina, it's legal for the cat to preside at a funeral. There's very little structure around a lot of stuff. So anyway, so we're talking about how do we live our lives in a way that is inspiring, not just to those in which we relate to today, but leaves an impact on them so that they might lead their lives also in an inspiring way, allowing others to see the Christ living in them. Jesus asked two very important questions as he has calmed the storm and he turns back to his companions. Those two questions are this: why are you such cowards? The second is, don't you have any faith at all? And a couple weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, when Phil asked me if I was available for this Sunday morning, I said, well, send me what your sermon series are, and I'll pick a text. And that was the text that came to me right away. And so those two questions have been part of my everyday conversation. I read them every morning. They're at the top of my devotional page. Every morning I ask myself those questions. Why am I such a coward? Why don't I have much faith? It's important for us to take those kinds of questions and grapple with them. Don't write the questions down and stick them in that Bible and let the dust accumulate. Struggle with them. Recognize that it's a storm in your life. Put it up on the table of your thought process. Don't leave it down underneath where you only happen to see it if somebody kicks it. Jesus can calm the storms of our lives. But we have to be in a conversation with him about that. We have to recognize that relationship is only valid when we are reaching out just as he is reaching out to us. An active and proactive faith is a faith that is valid. It's a faith that moves us from a static understanding of Christianity and how we as Christians are to live our lives into a dynamic, evolving, transforming relationship that starts with Jesus Christ, but it quickly spreads out in the community around us. And not just the people in your pews. Each one of us here, if you're in the workplace, you know a coworker that could use a light, that could use Jesus Christ, that doesn't even want to acknowledge the storm that they are living in. And you can perhaps provide that opening, that opportunity for them to start thinking about they don't have to live in that storm. We all know someone. It might be someone as close as a sister or a brother, the next door neighbor, a spouse. Could be your father, your children. It could be someone that you haven't met yet, but one of these days, in this next week, God is going to put your paths together. And what will your response be? Are you too afraid to share your faith? And I'm not talking about sharing your faith just in a verbal sense. Because unless you have a solid friendship or an understanding with that person, verbalizing your faith might just plug their ears up. They have to know that your concern is genuine. And oftentimes that sharing of the faith is an activity, not just a verbalization. So don't get me wrong there. But allow Christ to work through you. Don't sit in the bottom of the boat afraid that it's going to be swamped. Reach out. Let Christ take your hand. Let the storms of your life abate. In his name we pray. Amen.